Welcome to JAT Chat, presented by the Journal of Athletic Training, the official journal of the National Athletic Trainers Association. I'm Dr. Shelby Baez, an assistant professor in the Department of Exercise and Sports Science at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and the co-host of JAT Chat with Dr. Erin Reifsteck. Today, I have the pleasure of being joined by Drs. Erin Reifsteck and Dr. J.D. DeFreese. Dr. Reifsteck is an associate professor in the Department of Kinesiology at the University of North Carolina at Greensboro. And Dr. DeFreese is a teaching associate professor in the Department of Exercise and Sports Science at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And they are the co-authors of Call It an Evolution, Promoting Student-Athlete Wellbeing During the Transition from Collegiate Sport. So thank you both so much for joining me today.
Great.
All right. Yeah, so we can just jump right in here. So I'm going to start off with a very broad question for our listeners. What prompted the development of this brief review, current clinical concepts manuscript on student-athlete transition?
Yeah, I can talk briefly. So we sort of had been doing work in this space separately for probably 5 years or so, and we kind of connected. Kind of at the height of the pandemic during lockdown, and Erin had reached out and suggested that maybe we chat, pun not intended, with the name of the show. And we realized that we really were doing a lot of similar work in some of the same populations of college student athletes transitioning out of sports, and subsequently did some work and are still doing some projects together with some collaborators. But we also, when the call came out for this special issue, there was just an interest in us kind of telling a little bit more of a narrative story that was clinically or practically relevant with kind of the research that we had. So, Erin, I don't know if you want to add some other things.
No, I think that's a good summary of how kind of our partnership came to be. I think JD mentioned COVID. I think generally COVID gave us some time to think about and reflect on our work and where we've been and where we're going. And certainly the various disparities that exist in society too, even beyond the scope of the work that we do. And that, along with kind of the growing focus on athlete health and well-being in the past couple of years that I think was starting before that, but then, has picked up even more so. I think just gave us time to reflect on this. And like JD said, the narrative piece was a good way to go about telling some of that story that we haven't had a chance to do in other formats.
Yeah, and I absolutely loved reading this article. And one of the things that really stuck out to me when I was reading it was at the conclusion of the paper, you all ended with a quote by Serena Williams. And she states that she didn't like the word retirement, but preferred to use the word transition to describe this evolution away from tennis. And even in the title of your paper, you all use this idea of evolution. Can either of you just kind of touch on the nuances between potentially framing retirement versus transition for student athletes and why that may be impactful?
Yeah, so I think anytime that you can quote the GOAT, Serena, in a paper, you should. But I really appreciated her quote because, for one, retirement seems to indicate kind of a discrete event. You're an athlete, now you're not. But as we talk about in the paper, it's really more of a process that folks move through over time. And I think also that term also has kind of a binary nuance to it, which hints at some of the way that outcomes have been viewed as being binary, either good or bad outcomes through retirement, rather than the continuum of experiences that people actually have. And I think the reason I really liked what Serena said, calling it an evolution, is that kind of implies a more positive, kind of strengths-based approach that focuses on kind of that continued progression and development and growth that occurs. The sport's not the end of it, right?
Yeah, I think sometimes we just automatically go, you're an athlete or you're not an athlete, or you're playing sport or you're not playing sport. And it's much more complex than just that binary outcome of yes or no in this case, for sure. Dr. DeFreese, do you have any other additional thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think the things that Erin mentioned kind of mirror the history of the research in the space, right? Really, the research on athlete transition has really only been going on for about 30 years. And I would even say the first 10 years were sort of just more thinking about how it may or may not be different from other workplace-based transitions, right? For some sport is work, for some sport is leisure or a major amateur activity. But it's really been in the last 10 that this work has really thought about, oh, this is a transition experience. It's a process rather than a discrete event. And that there are a lot of potential areas that it touches, right? It touches physical functioning, social functioning, mental functioning, and in a case especially for student athletes, but even for professional athletes who retire at relatively younger ages, according to the general population, it's an occupational transition. What are we going to do after? What are we going to pursue next? And even for a very small percentage, I know we're talking about collegiate athletes, but even professional athletes that are maybe independently wealthy, they still might want to do things with their life after they play. Speaking of people that are independently wealthy, right? Serena Williams, right? There's things that she wants to do with her life, right? As she evolves or transitions out of the sport.
Yeah, and I definitely agree. Whenever you get a chance to be able to talk about the GOAT in a podcast, you should always do that. Hence my question. JD, you bring up a really great point that it's not just collegiate athletes, but we can think about this existing in professional athletes as well. And in many of the settings that athletic trainers may be working in, potentially military populations and having that level of athletic identity. So definitely something that as sports medicine providers, we should be cognizant of. So along those lines, what are potentially some of the consequences if we don't start to really consider optimizing this student athlete transition, this professional athlete transition after they finish sport or their career?
They can be broad and kind of far reaching, and they're not really one group or one experience for everyone. But again, those kind of 4 buckets are what we often look at. Mental functioning, right? Think things like depression, anxiety, but more positive outcomes, right? Like resilience or enjoyment. Social functioning, support systems, conflict, negative social interactions, physical functioning, right? Health-related quality of life, movement, lifespan, ability, or maybe impaired function. And then a lot of things that might impact occupational functioning, such as athletic identity. Erin, I know identity is something that you focused a lot of your work on.
Identity crisis is the way that some athletes have described what it's like to transition out of their athletic career, trying to figure out who am I now that I'm no longer an athlete. And I know in some of the programming that we've done with graduating student athletes, they have commented to us, well, this is the first time anyone has asked me who I am besides being a softball player, right? So that's a really profound thing to be reflecting on when you're 22 years old. So certainly there's that identity piece. A lot of our work has focused on more of the physical health related quality of life, which goes hand in hand with the mental health. So decrease physical activity without dietary adjustments. That obviously has some impact for metabolic concerns, but also just kind of general self-presentation, body image concerns around how your body is changing in terms of its fitness, its function, its appearance. And then, this is the space of athletic training, the long-term impact of injuries and some of the functional limitations that can come with that. And also just sort of like a broader mindset around that. With athletics, I think there's often sort of this mantra of sacrificing your physical health, mental health, for the sake of performance and kind of deprioritizing that. And so that can change as you're transitioning out, where maybe those priorities need to shift.
Another thing that's sometimes, again, this isn't a group that's a monolith, right? There's a lot of differences, individual differences, but structural changes, right? Whether it's collegiate athletes or professional athletes having a very structured kind of lifestyle and work, training, school, often not totally dictated by them, right? And there's some negatives to that. But often athletes report when they transition out of sport that they kind of struggle how to fill the time or how to structure their own life when it is entirely then autonomous on themselves, how to reintegrate in interpersonal relationships or with family relationships. Again, those things can also go perfectly well, but sometimes those are things that can be a struggle. Again, we know that student athletes perhaps might work more than 20 hours a week at their sport, right? But whether it's 20 hours or more, what do they do with that time, right? When that is not there. And it's hard for most people in a non-sport based workforce to exercise for 10, 15, 20 hours a week, right? Like, and then do they want to exercise? A lot of Erin's work, how do they get physical activity? Can they transition exercise from either their career or major endeavor to kind of leisure activity?
So I'm hearing a lot of physical, emotional, social consequences that can all occur as a result of not effectively preparing athletes to be able to transition out of their sport. So I think probably the next step on a lot of our listeners' mind is, what do we do about it? And you all put a beautiful infographic in this manuscript that I absolutely loved. Can you all just kind of walk us through what some of the recommendations you all have provided specifically for sports medicine providers to help facilitate this transition out of sport?
A couple of different recommendations we had in there. For me, I think one of the ones that really stands out that I've been focusing on a lot recently is sort of providing transition guidance to athletes as they're transitioning out in terms of navigating their health outside of that embedded healthcare system. So I was speaking about my work at a Power 5 school a couple of years back, and I talked to one of the women's soccer players, and she said to me, well, I have no idea how to make an appointment to see a doctor. Like, that's all been done in-house here for me. All my healthcare has been, taken care of within athletics. And I don't think she's alone in that experience. I think JD can also speak to some of the NFL players' experience as well with the work that they do over at Chapel Hill. But so that is like just a big shift in sort of the structure and the resources that are provided to now having to navigate that on your own. And so one of the big recommendations is to be able to find ways to extend some of the current policies and resources to at least be able to provide some guidance to athletes to understand that time is limited, finances are limited in athletic departments, but most will complete some kind of exit interview with somebody. So can that be with somebody in the sports medicine staff? Can there be some kind of screening? And then sort of directing them to the resources that they might want to touch base on, whether that's nutrition, whether that's physical training, whether that is sports psychology, and navigating sort of the mental piece of it. But that sort of thinking more on a policy level is something that I've been passionate about more recently.
Yeah, I mean, I think some of that clinical education, psychoeducation, just kind of personal health education, it can absolutely be more efficient, right, for a clinician to make the appointment or to put the records in the EMR and to kind of shield the student athlete from that. But maybe as they matriculate a little bit farther in their program, explaining how and why some of this stuff is done and explaining like, hey, if you're going to want these records later, here's who owns them. Here's how to access the EMR, right? Like here's how to do some of those things. A reasonable model is, I know in, clinical sports psychologists at any spot, but especially working with student athletes, often have an exit out of treatment, right? And part of the exit out of treatment plan is, where are you going next? Are you still going to want services? Even if you don't, let's talk about how you could access them if you start to have mental health concerns or want to use proactive services. And so, and it's not that clinicians don't do this, but they have a lot of athletes to work with. Some of them may or may not be as interested in this as others. But it becomes a pretty blunt reality to navigate the medical system for any of us without kind of all the records and medical histories that might be relevant to student athletes.
Yeah, and those are just some excellent, tangible recommendations that I think a lot of athletic trainers can start to implement today, which is absolutely fantastic. I feel like we could talk about this topic for a very long time, but to start to wrap it up, potentially, can each of you individually give me what you consider to be a take-home point? What's the one thing that you want to make sure our listeners get from this podcast and from reading the manuscript?
Yeah, and I'll even say it's maybe a little bit beyond this specific paper, but sports medicine clinicians, sports psychology practitioners, the holistic medical team for student athletes are just so important to athlete transition. Whether hopefully you already know that, and if you don't, we have data that maybe we don't talk about in this paper that shows how important you all are. They disclose information to you. They're willing to talk about these things. And in many cases, I think probably you're all aware that there are barriers you have to help them once they leave, right? And so I think hopefully this paper comes off as that, like a proactive thing, but certainly I wouldn't want anyone to read it to say that we think there are problems with the providers. That's not in any way what we think. We actually think the providers do good and can do so much more good if we can maybe help with some of the structures around them.
I think, athletic training has really been embracing that holistic approach, as JD mentioned. And so I think in doing that, one of the conversations that I've had with one of my athletic training colleagues here, works in college athletics, came to this idea of, okay, then we should probably broaden our focus from just return to play, but also return to healthy living. And so what does that look like on a day-to-day basis as we're treating student athletes, but also then as they're transitioning out? How do we ensure that they're transitioning into a healthy lifestyle that will foster that holistic well-being long-term?
Yeah, and I know you kind of asked for one take home, but I will say one other thing too. This is a critical time for athletes, right? The transition process. And I think the other thing that we kind of see in some of our data is that they don't think other people understand that, and they don't think other people can really help them process that. In many cases, they work with clinicians that do help them, but at least at first, I think they kind of feel a little bit alone, and that they're dealing with an experience that others can't understand. And there's probably some truth to that, but there are phenomenal providers, hopefully, who are listening to this that understand that that's probably not the case. But how to have that conversation, right, and how to get the ball rolling, so to speak, so that athletes transitioning out can utilize resources that are there to help them.
So communication, broadening our scope of thinking more than just sport, but thinking about life and the long-term consequences of sport on our athletes is going to be a huge thing here, what it sounds like. Erin and JD, thank you both so much for joining me today. It's been an absolute pleasure. This article is available free of charge by the Journal of Athletic Training, and I highly recommend everyone go and download this manuscript in the current special issue of the Journal of Athletic Training. So again, thank you all so much, and we will see you next time.